Hello to all. Here today in a replay cast of the Tier 8 British Tech Tree Light Cruiser, the Edinburgh. We're on the map Shatter, and the mode is Domination. We are middle tier in 7 to 9 matchmaking, as you can see. Here today with two of my diff mates. But anyway, it's going to be a replay class. They're in the Kaga and Vladivostok respectively. Anyhow, spawning into the map, we've spawned below A cap in the Edin. I am regrinding the British Light Cruisers branch for the Research Bureau, so I thought I would highlight some of the mid to high tier cruisers on the way up as I re-experience the grind. Now, my first time around in the Edinburgh, I will admit I found it to be quite uncomfortable compared to the Fiji. This was, of course, quite a while back now. We did not have the existence of ships such as the French destroyers or Russian battleships, which have affected the potency of the British cruisers. The Fiji, for example, used to be quite the highlight of the British line. However, changes to both matchmaking for Tier 7s as well as just the introduction of heavily armored ships, such as the Soviet battleships, have made playing those mid-tier British cruisers quite a bit more difficult. Now coming into the match, just slowly approaching A cap from below, making use of the Edinburgh's excellent detection, or concealment rather. You'll see on the screen ahead of you that she has a 9.2 kilometer concealment rating. This is of course because she shares the Fiji's low detection, but as a tier 8 she gets access to that concealment module, so I get to sneak quite close to the cap. My detection is just now covering the entire cap. Note that my flank does not currently have a destroyer because the Asashio has gone off on his own, so I am acting as the scout for this cap. However, I do have a carrier in my division, which means I can make use of my allied Kaga's aerial spotting to provide vision. Pulling up to the cap, no one's quite concessioning yet. We did see briefly the Mahan, thanks to my Kaga's rocket plane scouting. My Vladivostok, of course, requesting some additional information. As the Kaga begins flying out of the cap, we're going to advance forward into the next piece of cover. Now, the Edinburgh, like all British light cruisers, lacks access to high explosive. Instead, she has that short fuse improved penetration angle armor piercing. She has a 12-gun setup, 4 triple turrets in an ABXY layout, 2 forward, 2 to the rear, and a triple torpedo tube at the center line with a 10 kilometers of range. She has smokescreen and hydroacoustic, and is of course the first British light cruiser to have access to the super heal. The super heal allows you to heal up to 50% of your health at a time, more or less. This is of course mitigated by some points by the low overall hit point pool of the Edinburgh. Now you see me here smoking up. I know the Fiji's in front of me because of my allied Kaga's spawning, but you'll see I'm declining to fire. That is because of course the Fiji is inside of my smoke detectability firing radius. The Edinburgh has a smoke firing penalty of 5.5. The Fiji is 5 kilometers away, as you can see from my hydroacoustic, so I cannot open fire until he is eliminated. Thankfully, he does catch a torpedo, which I pre-launched thanks to having seen him based on my Kaga's information, and only now, once he is dead, can I begin to open up fire. I did pop one of my smokes earlier in order to get a proper angle out. I'm eating a radar, putting some nice AP shells into that North Carolina, however. But as you can see, the two battleships, having pushed that side, cannot really readily engage me. My Kaga does light up the Mahan, so I'm going to switch temporarily to him. You can see that British short fuse allowing me to put quite a bit of power onto the Mahan. We lose vision, unfortunately, after putting about 5k into him. But we're doing quite alright. My hydroacoustic in the meantime that I've popped to keep myself safe within my smokescreen does pick up the torpedoes as we continue to reverse. Tirpitz pushing forward. Thankfully for him, he gets to dodge the torpedoes thanks to my spotting from the Mahan. Take a shot at the Mahan as he's temporarily spotted, but I am going to shift my guns back to the NCAL. Just staying nice and safe. My smoke screen's about to time out, but note that the Scharnhorst is close enough to spot me, but the NCAL isn't. So as long as I complete my turn soon enough, I'll be just fine. So I'm at about half speed right now, just going to launch some torps in case they do decide to just keep pushing forward. But I do have to angle. Now the Edinburgh, like all the rest of the British light cruisers, has 16mm plate, which means anything bigger than 203mm guns, starting basically with the Henry IV's 240s, anything bigger than the 220s of the Moskva, can overmatch your plate with armor piercing. The Scharnhorst for 283s, of course, is on this list, so I do have to be quite careful. But kiting away, we can just easily disengage ourselves. Now, 2 battleships are not exactly what the Edinburgh is most specialized at killing, so I am going to disengage myself from the match. There's no point in me chasing the battleships. I'll leave that to my Tirpitz and Vladivostok. They should be able to take down a North Carolina and Scharnhorst, especially with my carrier buddy providing vision. Now, meanwhile, on the other side of the map, my team is currently losing, so I do have to try and make something happen. So I'm going to push towards the center. There's a Chapayev there that was damaged earlier by my allies, but was failed to be finished off. So I'm going to try and put some fire onto him if I can. He is kind of fading away, however, which leaves me with a much larger problem. As you can see, the Gorizia and Sinop on the enemy team are pushing down through that channel, so they are going to be the closest things to engaging me. Now, the Gorizia is a tier 7 Italian cruiser. This of course means she lacks high explosive, instead she has that Italian semi-armor piercing and armor piercing loadout, and unlike the tech tree variant Zara, she lacks the torpedo launchers. Instead she has that 6-kilometer German Hydro. That means while that Gorizia is alive, I can't really use my smoke screen even though it's up, because he'll just pop his Hydro and engage me. Now against the bounce angles of the mid-tier Italians, which are not as great as the Venezia, just gonna bow in and put shells into him. I know he doesn't have torpedoes, so I can just keep staying bow in on his broadside, and I'm gonna eventually punch him with my armor piercing shells. You can see that improved bounce angles in the short range, allowing me to citadel him repeatedly to dispatch him. He's coming onto my side, but I will have torpedo angles soon enough. And as long as I keep adjusting and he keeps giving me broadside, it'll be easy enough for me to just punch him and dispatch him. You can see that there's a significant amount of damage queued. Unlike in most tier 8 cruisers, I'm absolutely okay with taking damage trades with other cruisers because I have access to that British super heal. Damage that I take is more or less just an adrenaline rush buff than anything else. Anyhow, having dispatched the Zara, now we have to deal with the Sinop. And the Sinop does have 16-inch guns, or 406mm guns, which easily overmatch me. However, the Edinburgh is the last of the British cruisers to have a waterline citadel. Starting with the Leander to Edinburgh, the mid-tier British cruisers enjoy a waterline citadel, which makes them exceptionally difficult to citadel, especially at closer ranges. Unlike the Neptune and Minotaur that come after her, with their raised citadels, it's actually quite difficult, so brawling up close is not nearly as scary. Using my British single-fire torps here to just pre-torp, and swinging around to engage the Sinop in case they don't dispatch him. I do, however, manage to pick up my 3rd kill with the single-fire torps, nicely enough, and that's the middle squadron dispatched. That play, of course, was precipitated by my having information about where the Sinop was. You saw there that hydroacoustic that I popped earlier during the engagement with the Gorizia was not for any non-existent Gorizia torps, but was in fact just to keep an eye out on where the Sinop was during my engagement. Having dispatched him, I'm going to reverse out and attempt to take B. You'll note that our team has still yet to take a cap, so we've been bleeding points this whole time as we've been losing ships. Thankfully, we've been trading relatively evenly, so we still do have points to hold on to. However, it is fairly important that I catch a cap. Looks like the Chapayev is radaring me from the edge. So I'm gonna have to be a bit careful here. Contesting the cap, enemy Kaga in the meantime is sending attack planes my way. But as I mentioned earlier, I do have access to that heal, so the Kaga's high explosive dive bombers and fires are much less threatening than they would be to another tier 8 cruiser. I have access at heal, so taking some chip damage is not too much of a big deal. Now, the Edinburgh's AA suite is nothing particularly special. It's not horrific, but it's not great. Probably about on par with that of the Mogami, and definitely not anything close to American, and not anything close to the improved anti-aircraft suites of her higher tier counterparts Neptune and Minotaur. My allied Kaga does, passing over, attacking the Kagero, who's attacking his hull, does manage to give me some initial information as to the position of the Chapayev, and so with that information and the information of where the Seattle and Bismarck are, I'm able to make use of that to pre-angle. You can see he loaded armor piercing, so if I didn't have that additional information, it could have been potentially dangerous. Now the Chapayev does have 4 kilometer self-defense torpedoes. You can see that my pre-torps kind of missed him, but his launch angles are much poorer than mine. So I'm not too worried about him torping me. He has to give a significant amount of broadside to do so, and that amount of broadside would allow the Edinburgh to citadel him to hell. In the distance, you can see the Seattle is pumping some shell fire onto me. You could see some harassing shell fire coming from here, which tells me Seattle's roughly in this position. Having dispatched the Chapayev, I'm going to leave the Kagero to my allies. Hopefully my carrier buddy can take care of him, and I am going to try and take this cap. In the meantime, though, I do spot this Kaga. He's quite angled, but I do have those improved pen angles, and the Kaga, as an aircraft carrier, is quite thinly skinned, so I'm going to try and put some damage onto him. He's quite close. However, he's currently flying planes, which means I get to attack him with relative impunity. Still don't really know the relative position of the Bismarck, which is making me a bit nervous. Remember, the Bismarck has 15-inch or 381mm shells, so they quite easily overmatch me, but I'm going to have to rely on my good detectability, or rather, my low citadel and decent position. I have quite a bit of cover from several angles, so the ship would have to be right here. Shells beginning to fly onto me, so it looks like the Seattle has found angles on me based on the volume of high explosive. But I'm going to ignore them for now and attempt to stay on the Kaga. I do want to try and dispatch this Kaga while he's here, but you can see even a slight bit of angle starts to result in some of his torpedo bulge absorbing some hits and some ricochets. The pressure from that enemy fire does prompt me to smoke. Don't want to take too much aggression, which of course loses me vision of the Kaga, but we did inflict quite a bit of damage on him, so hopefully my carrier can follow up on that kill later. The Kagero that was harassing him did get turned around. My carrier buddy wasn't able to kill the Kagero, but as you can see has harassed him to a sufficient point where the Kagero is turned away. In addition, he's found the Seattle for me, so now I know I'm fairly safe. I see all the rest of my enemies. I'm going to fire on the Seattle. You can see the Bismarck is actually in range to shell me, and can shell me over that island cover over here, but it's a fairly difficult shot, so I feel safe enough to shell the Seattle. At range, you can see the Edinburgh's fairly lazy shells. Now I would like to go over and take C. We're still behind 400 points in spite of now having a cap advantage, thanks to that early point deficit that we accrued by not controlling a cap while they controlled 2. But it's hard for me to turn myself around in a safe fashion if I know the Seattle and Bismarck are both there. So instead what I'm going to do is push north toward the carrier and try and finish what I started. Now the carrier is liable to continue north and push behind this island, so I am going to need help from my carrier. So I'm calling my carrier division mate over. The carriers are one of the best ships at finishing off targets. We know that the carrier dropped down to about 15k health thanks to my earlier shelling. So I would like him to provide some air defense for me and give me just vision so I can fire on it. We do catch out the enemy carrier as my buddy in the Kaga sends his torpedo bomber squadron over his hull. He's at about 12k. Do land a couple more shells in, but these are going to be the last few shells. You can see that mountain that he's slid behind, kind of blocking my shots. Now the Kaga is particularly notable at tier 8 because he has a very large squadron of either torpedo bombers or dive bombers of 12 planes. And this is notable because the self-defense fighter of the Kaga, you can see the enemy Kaga, I believe, is taking direct action center, so he has an extra fighter. And what this means is he has 5 catapult fighters, which are going to intercept 5 planes. So you make 1 attack, and typically you don't have too many torpedoes left. However, you can see the enemy Kaga survived my buddy's first torpedo bomber attack. However, thanks to that large squadron size, even after the catapult fighter trims 5 planes, you still have a couple torpedo bombers left, and as a result, my buddy is able to finish off the Kaga for us, helping to stem the bleeding. Seattle is contesting the cap. The Kaga is dead. So I am going to move in toward the Seattle. Now, ordinarily, tier 8s versus tier 9s is a pretty lopsided fight, but do note that I have both my heal and hydro up. The Seattle doesn't have any torpedo threats, so we don't need the hydro that much. Just going to pop it in case there's some rogue Gagero torps kind of passing through. But with my super heal, fairly close proximity, and the fact that my Brindisi is already engaging the Seattle, I'm going to feel confident enough to engage this Seattle. You can see I'm on his broadside. The Seattle also has quite a low citadel, so you can see I'm having difficulty finding his citadel even fully broadside. Probably aiming a little too far forward. The Seattle's citadel box is basically just in the center of the ship, similar to the Helena or Cleveland before him. But full pen damage is still significant, so I'm going to clean up my 4th kill and defend the cap along with the help of my allied Brindisi. That leaves just the Bismarck, who is currently in the process of mauling my allied Vladivostok. My buddy Mobius there, holding on as best he can, but you can see there's quite a HP differential. I'm going to try and head over to him now that I'm closer in gun range. Bismarck, as I mentioned, does overmatch me all over, but he's quite clearly occupied trying to dispatch my div mate, so I'm going to try my best to save him. You can see the Bismarck with her heavy 50mm midsection plates is ricocheting a significant amount of my shells, especially at this range with the shells falling at such an oblique angle. However, with the short fuse does do a lot of damage, especially when it hits superstructure. Sadly, the Bismarck is able to dispatch my allied Vladivostok, but not before he blasts him with one last salvo. My Kaga is coming in to make sure the kill gets secured, but I'm also shelling, so let's see if I can get my Kraken. He does fire off a salvo at me, but I do get the Kraken beforehand. Ignoring him, not too concerned. At that kind of range, the Bismarck is not likely to end my life, even though I was kind of fully broadside. Thanks to the Bismarck's relatively wonky dispersion, even after the buffs, not too worried, and we do secure a nice Kraken, sitting at about 150,000 damage now, which is a pretty good total for the Edinburgh, considering her relatively middling reload, unlike the Neptune and Minotaur that come after her. As you can see, with that kill advantage, and over the course of the past 3 minutes, we finally managed to close the point gap, in spite of the cap sticking. Because we're now up 2 ships, we're now only down just about 80 points. However, we can still lose this game. You can see there's only 2 minutes left on the clock. If the Kagero somehow manages to kill one or more of us and contests the cap. So the safest order of business now is just to have the carrier find the Kagero, and then the Brindisi and I should just go to sea and either contest or take the cap. Ideally, I would have the Brindisi probably sit behind this rock or sit around this rock because it provides them cover from this side. My carrier is screening the southern flank, so he's telling me right now that he's not spotted, so he knows the planes, or he knows rather the Kagero is not within the spotting radius of his rocket planes, and Kaga rocket planes have a rather large spotting radius of 9 kilometers with CE, 10 kilometers without, so he does give a fair amount of warning. Brindisi is now capping. I don't quite have my Hydro yet, so this is a bit risky. But at this point, with the Brindisi in the cap, even if I catch a stray torpedo, it might be fine as long as we trade, and I have a carrier hunting. My Hydro comes up, so I probably should pop the Hydro immediately. Not doing so yet. A bit of a mistake on my part, but, you know, this is, of course, easier in retrospect. Like the Brindisi, though, I am going to contest the cap. However, sudden detection and sudden minimap presence of the Kagero gives an alarmingly close Kagero, but at this kind of range, he is close enough for me to easily kind of dispatch him. Now, With that said, was a pretty decent game. If my Chrome would capture, you can look at the scorecard. Thank you very much. So, managed to actually print screen my scorecards from yesterday. So it was a 158,000 damage at the end of the game, 252 shell hits. Sadly, I can't look at the ribbon distribution because this is, of course, a screenshot. 3 torpedo hits from that Synop kill in the channel, 11 planes shot down, 2 in-caps, 6 kills, 8 citadels, 2 defender ribbons, 1 solo capture, 8 secondary hits, and 2 spotting ribbons for a Confed Kraken First Blood. And if we shift over to team score, which I failed to open properly, 1 second. If I shift over to team score, if my screen would capture it, team score wise, we do manage to make, sorry about the jostling, a nice 2,877 base experience, well above the rest of my allies, thanks in large part to both the damage we put onto destroyers and also just capping and defended ribbons. So quite obviously, quite the performance. My allies are not too far behind me, Kaga providing more of a spotting role than damage role in this case, and Vladivostok holding the line. If we go to the detailed report, we'll see of our 158,000 damage, 127 came from our shells. Of course, we only fire AP because we are a British cruiser, and the rest from our torpedoes. No flooding damage or anything like that. Damage-wise, you'll see we took quite a bit from armor piercing and just a tiny bit from HE. The Edinburgh's really not too troubled by enemy trade fire. But yeah, heading forward, that was a fairly fantastical, or not fantastical, but a fairly good Edinburgh game, showcasing a lot of her strengths and also some of her weaknesses, given the amount of shatters you saw during that game. I'm gonna head client side just so we can look at the Edinburgh in port, talk a little more in depth about some of those strengths and weaknesses. So if you see some flickering, just gonna do my logins and then we can get this show on the road from there. Logging in, still on patch 0.811 as you can see. Still showing off that wintry Puerto Rico on the screen, which is entertaining, I suppose. World of Warships client added as per usual. Now the Edinburgh as a tier 8 cruiser, she kind of sits at the cusp of edging into that late game British cruiser territory. She is of course a town class cruiser, represented by both the Edinburgh and her younger sister, the Belfast at tier 7, who is in a slightly more modern fit out. The Edinburgh of course is a tier 8 tech tree cruiser, available to all players. And she kind of plays like an upgrade from the Fiji. It used to be the case that the Fiji had much better matchmaking because the Fiji was often top tier, but nowadays the matchmaker for tier 7s is quite a bit less kind, making the Edinburgh seem somewhat superior in terms of some transitory states. So this is my Edinburgh. I'm currently running a dedicated Edinburgh captain because I am doing a regrind, of course, as I mentioned, so I already have a Minotaur captain. So running only 14 points right now. The essential points are the 10 pointers. So priority target, adrenaline rush, superintendent, concealment expert, and then you're good to go from there. Since this is going to be a dedicated Edinburgh captain, I've opted for also taking smokescreen and expert marksman. If you saw throughout the course of the game, the Edinburgh's turrets are fairly sluggish, so even with expert marksman, they remain a bit sluggish, but it does alleviate some of that horrid turret traverse. Consumable wise, take your damage control, then your smokescreen, then your heal, and then your hydro. Now, you can have the option of running the surveillance radar on the high tier British cruisers, starting with the Edinburgh. This is, of course, the American cruiser radar. It has an action time of 30 seconds and a range of 10 kilometers, identical, of course, to the one found on Baltimore, but I find that's slightly more stable to run smokescreen in a random battles scenario. Upgrade-wise, very straightforward. Main armament, engine survivability. Aiming, your AA is pretty trash, so 2 more flak puffs really doesn't help. Steering gears, because you can't take propulsion, and concealment expert. Armor-wise, she's a standard British cruiser, as I mentioned, so the extremities are 16mm, so you can get overmatched through the bow and stern by anything with guns bigger than a Moskva. Anything with caliber greater than 220mm guns can overmatch that 16mm plate. 19mm on the midsection. And then finally a belt, including a raised central belt section of 114. Deck armor-wise, note the very thin 19, but the central 51. So this midsection here is a very important strip of armor on the Edinburgh. This is the only place you can really bounce battleship shells. Now I wouldn't recommend trying to bounce battleship shells on your thinly armored Edinburgh, but it can be done. Now plating aside, the next most important aspects to look at are of course the citadel. So we look at the citadel, it's fairly waterline. It's the last of the British cruisers to have this waterline citadel. It has strips of 51mm upper armor as well, except in this central section. So you're actually the most vulnerable at this central section of 6mm armor, where anything that defeats that belt, anything that defeats this 114mm belt is going to plunge through and strike this 6mm plate, and obviously even I think destroyer caliber AP can overmatch 6mm plate, so you're vulnerable right in the center. But overall, this large citadel of the Edinburgh is fairly hard to hit just because it's so low in the water. This is the last of the British cruisers to have this low in the water citadel, of course, starting at the Neptune, if I can view it. I'm not sure I can even view it, but we'll see. If you go to the Neptune over here, you start having this stepped citadel that's raised. As you can see, the whole citadel is above the waterline, and the midsection is particularly raised up. So this is the last time you get to enjoy the potato armor protecting you. Anyhow, that was the Edinburgh. This is my second round running through here, as I mentioned. The first time around, I actually struggled quite a bit with the Edinburgh, but the game has changed a lot, and I've gotten quite a bit more experience on light cruisers, so I found her to be actually quite comfortable. A very flexible package overall. She's a British light cruiser, but unlike the Neptune that comes after her, she has excellent concealment, which allows her to make use of tools potentially like radar, but also just act as a bit of a hybrid scout cruiser and take on some of the roles of a destroyer in the mid to late game, if necessary. Overall, a pretty fantastic tier 8, limited of course in some ways by the fact that she is squishy in overall health pool, and limited in firepower due to firing only armor piercing, and having relatively short range, pretty normal light cruiser range, but definitely on the second pass around an excellent silver ship, and a good one to showcase your mastery of how to play some of the more fragile ships in World of Warships. Anyhow, that'll be all for now. I hope you enjoyed the Kraken gameplay in the Edinburgh. I'm enjoying my time grinding back towards the Minotaur. And I'll catch you all later, hopefully with some second round robin gameplay on the Neptune. Cheers.